welcome back. Now we are going to go deep in the sense to analyze a little bit about calculation and understanding. So people sometimes tend to think like grandmasters tend to calculate like quite a lot, and that grandmasters are like computers and they can see everything. So it's very hard in general to understand when is the right moment when you should calculate. That's the hardest part in general. Calculation is about recognizing when is the right moment to calculate. Probably you have heard about, well, in calculation you have to use the candidate move, therefore you have to consider first checks, captures, and threats. Well, yes, that's quite true, but I will add other details about that. But before you start to calculate, what you should try to do, I would say basically when the position is to recognize when the position is very complex. When is the key moment that you need to start to calculate? And that's the most important part. One indicator when is the critical moment is actually when you realize that your pieces and your opponent pieces, they are confronting to each other. Basically, for instance, this knight is putting some pressure against this pawn, putting some pressure against this square, controlling potentially the e1, the queen is guarding the knight, kind of targeting the pawn, and of course I'm doing quite sort of the same too. I'm putting pressure against the pawn on g7, my rook is putting pressure against the pawn on h6, potentially maybe I could try to teleport my queen to g4, that will be of course very good. So those are kind of some patterns that I have to incorporate whenever I'm seeing any position. So that is kind of an indicator that, okay, maybe this is a good moment for me to calculate. What should I do then? This is kind of the right evaluation, is the right moment to calculate. I should try to calculate like a computer. The answer I would say is not really. First, what you have to try to do before to getting into calculation is to try to understand the position. And I will give you three different steps or three different stages that you have to use whenever you are trying to get a better understanding about what is just happening in a position. So basically the first step, and it's about actually, let's just be clear, this is about scanning. This is not about analyzing. There is a difference between scanning and analyzing. Analyzing is considering a move to play, going deeper. Considering and scanning is different. It's just about seeing the position and trying to understand what is just happening. So the first thing that you have to take a look on your scanning process is, of course, king safety. That's the first thing that you have to take a look. Of course, this example is quite simple. You will realize after a few more moves. It's quite simple to understand, but first, this is the first step that you have to take a look. King safety. If you think that your king is better, you will say that you could add like +1 in a sense. That is a method that I think it could help you quite a lot. So if you think that your king is better, you could say that +1. If you think like it's not like better, you could say like it's even, so 0. You don't need to add any point. And then you have to go to the next step. It's about scanning. Once again, not analyzing. Scanning is one thing, analyzing is another. When you analyze, you add one move to play. I probably know that you are considering what to do. And you are considering maybe bishop g7, rook take h6, knight e4, and so on. All of you are considering this because that's normally how we tend to think. So, but the next step, the first step, king safety. Second step, material. You have to count pieces. You don't have to say like, oh yes, I up a pawn, but my pieces are not doing well. No, doesn't matter. It's about counting pieces, material. And the third stage or third aspect will be in this case positional. And when it's about positional aspects, actually you have to consider two factors, two important things. One is the quality of the pawn structure, and the other is the quality of your pieces, if your pieces are active or not. So this is about scanning once again. If your pieces are active or not, that's another important detail. So remember that, because whenever the position gets blurry or more complicated, using this method could definitely help you a lot. It's very important to learn that. So as I said, first, king safety. Second, material. Third, positional. And when I say positional, I'm referring to the fact of considering the pawn structure, the quality of the pawn structure, and considering how active your pieces are. And if you have loose pieces too as well. I don't want to go deep in that because that's not the purpose. I just want to give you some insights about the position. So, based on the king safety, of course, I think my king is kind of, both kings looks like kind of the same, but the proximity of my pieces, I have more pieces putting pressure against the black king. So just because of that, I would say that my king is better. So I would say +1. If we go to the next step, will be material. In material, we are even, right? You don't need to spend much time counting how many pawns do you have, but it's very helpful actually. The third step will be positional. Are my pieces more active? Well, that's an easy question to answer too. My rook is more connected to the king's eye weaknesses too. My knight potential is going to d4. My bishop is putting pressure against the g7 pawn, and so on. So, of course, I know that doing this is like, okay, but I want to calculate. I want to know when to calculate. But I will recommend you, before you get into calculation, scan first the position. And when I say in scanning, is to not spend more than 3 minutes kind of seeing what is happening in the position. Not going deep, just scanning. As I said, king safety. My king is better? Yes. My pieces are more active? Yes. Material, we are even? Yes. So that's very important to understand. If you determine that you are better in that sense, then you're good to calculate. That's the first step, to understand first what you are doing in the position. It's very, very important to understand first. You understand first, then you calculate, and then you try to re-evaluate the position. It's not the opposite. It's like many people start to calculate, then they evaluate, and then they keep calculating. No, that's not good. First, you evaluate the position. First, you try to understand. And that's why these 3 steps will help you to understand better the position. And then you try to calculate. And how do you calculate? Of course, probably most of you have heard about the candidate move. Of course, that idea was suggested by Kotov a lot of years ago. And he suggests that first you have to consider all the most forcing move, meaning checks comes first, then captures, because there is nothing more forced than a captures, besides the checks, of course, captures. Then I will not say threat, because that's what most players tend to say, and they stick to that. I would say actually pawn move, because whenever you're making a pawn move, the position changes forever. Probably you will not consider that, because that's most likely what players tend to do, like, oh, I will make a pawn move because it's lively and so on. But making a pawn move is actually very important, and considering then it's extremely important, because whenever you're making a pawn move, the position changes forever, because pawns won't go backwards. So that's a rule, of course. And then threats. So remember, first checks, captures, pawn move, and threats. So I will say these 4 steps when you are starting to calculate. To evaluate king safety, material, and positional. And in positional, of course, you have to consider the quality of the pawn structure and the quality of your pieces. So I know it's a lot of info, but it's very important to do this. It's about understanding. It's not about just calculating like a computer. Because, of course, in this position, it might look like simple. Yeah, I will find the best move. Very easy. But when you're playing a more complex position and there is nothing to do, then it will be very hard. So it's very important to learn how to understand the position first. So here is quite simple, the next move. Actually, to give some meaning to my pieces, what it should be the best moves in this case for white, of course. Because, of course, I can see that I'm putting pressure against this pawn. And if this pawn is under attack, it means that h6 is not very healthy. Of course, this pawn will be very soft. And of course, removing the pawn on g7, removing defenders will be something very good. So what should be the first move that I should consider in this case? Of course, do I have any logical check in this position? Not really. I mean, no checks. So then what comes next? Captures. Do I have any logical capture? And it's about considering, by the way, because what most people tend to do is calculating right away. What they start to do is like, okay, let's just calculate bishop g7. They start to calculate bishop g7, or they start to calculate rook h6. Then realize that bishop g7 is not working, and they jump into rook h6. Then they realize that rook h6 is not working. Then they go back to bishop g7 to see if they miss something. And then they realize bishop g7 is not working, and they go back to rook h7. So that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is first consider your candidates. So first you consider bishop g7. because it's a logical capture. And of course, when I'm saying consider your candidate, is based, of course, on your goals. Your goal in this case is to attack the king. So of course you have to try to consider all the logical captures, relevant captures. Because for instance, when I'm saying captures, probably we'll consider like, oh, queen takes is a capture, yes. But what is the purpose of playing queen takes? Of course, none. So it's very important to consider the relevant captures, relevant checks, relevant pawn move, and relevant threats. So there is no relevant capture than capturing on g7, no relevant pawn move. Relevant threats, I think there is one, knight d4 for instance. That will be very good, very clean. You're bringing the knight, potentially bringing the knight to f5. So now, what should be the next move for white? What is the best move? Quite easy, quite simple. Now we have to combine. We consider already bishop g7, that's one option. Rook h6, of course, I would say that we can just not eliminate that. Actually, that's another important detail, by the way. When you're doing all this calculation process and you realize that the position is very complex to find the best move, it's important to use the elimination process to eliminate all the moves that doesn't make any sense. So in this case, for instance, you will eliminate something like queen d3 because it doesn't make any sense. You will eliminate rook h6. So then you will basically narrow your options. You will reduce the amount of options that you have, and then it will be easier to calculate, because what it happens to many players is like they calculate like very just in a very they don't have order to calculate, and calculation requires order. So that's why first comes understanding, then candidate move, then elimination process, and then you pick your move. That's the right process. So understanding comes first, based on what I said at the beginning about considering the king safety, material, and of course positional aspects. Then candidate move, and then the elimination process. You eliminate the move that doesn't make any sense. But of course, these are concepts. This is not a law or something like that. This is not a rule. It's just something that will help you to understand better any position that you're playing. So what shall we do here? So of course, I just want to be clear. When I'm saying this about the process that we normally, the grandmasters tend to calculate, of course, you don't, we will skip certain things. It's like when you're learning a language, right? You start to learn how to say A, B, C, D, and then you connect the words. You won't calculate like at once everything. You first need to know the basic patterns, and then you will connect the dots. So in order to be very coherent in this position, of course, the king is your target. It's very lonely. Another thing, by the way, when you're attacking the king, divide the board in two and count how many pieces do you have. If you think you have more pieces than your opponent's defenders, most likely something should work for you. Tactics most likely will work for you. How many pieces do we have? Well, we have the rook. And when I'm saying pieces, I'm referring mainly to rooks, well, everything but pawns, basically. So I have the rook, the knight, the bishop pointing against the pawn, potentially the queen too as well. So I have more pieces because black, unfortunately, just have one rook and potentially one bishop that is pointing against the king side. So black just basically has two pieces. And I have rook, knight, queen, bishop pointing against the king side. So it's 4 against 2. So it's very simple to understand that most likely if I do something on the king side, it should work because I have more pieces there. So it's very important to understand that before jumping into the conclusion that bishop e7 is the best move. Yes, of course, probably some players instantly will consider the bishop e7 is the best way. But it's very important to do all this, because when the position is simple, yes, it's easier to understand why this works. But when the position is tricky, then it's hard. So the best move in this case is, yes, definitely, bishop takes g7. You just capture and remove this defender. Because of course you have to be coherent. You have to try to attack that king. Moreover, you have more pieces. Quantity over quality. So king takes, and whenever you're attacking the king, of course, we could find this type of move based on the candidate move. Or we could say that, well, we don't have any logical check. We don't have any logical pawn move. We don't have any, well, what else would we have? Well, logical threat, yes, 94, and we have a very logical capture, bishop g7. So we consider these two. Which we should consider first? Well, the captures. Captures come first. Checks at the top, captures number 2, and number 3 and 4 is up to you. It could be pawn move, it could be threats. It's completely up to you. But the number 1 and number 2 checks and captures come first, and that's the thing that you have to consider. As I said, consider, not to calculate. That's a mistake that most players tend to do. They calculate like crazy. No, it's about considering. That's the first step. So that's why first you consider your options, and then you use the elimination process. So bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now we need to incorporate my pieces, and that's why I play knight to d4. Because in this way I'm targeting the queen, and always I'm seizing the initiative and creating threats, relevant threats. It's not like, what is a relevant threat, for instance? A relevant threat is creating a threat against something that makes sense. If I say, you know, I want to attack your knight with rook b3, that is a threat, yes, but it's not really relevant. I mean, I'm attacking your king, and you will start to attacking my knight. Actually, you will be helping me, even though knight f4, knight g6. So that's the way you have to be very specific in that sense. Relevancy is very important. So knight to d4, targeting the queen, queen comes to c4. Now you bring the queen to g4. So you will have to see all this in advance, and the reality is not really. As long as you calculate. So this is what I do normally. I establish literally a minimum of move that I should calculate in any position. So a minimum of move for all of you should be at least 3 full move with all his lines. 3 full moves, 3, not less. You could add more, good, but don't try to calculate like computer. First, try to understand what is the real goal here. So knight d4, and of course checks come first, quite easy. Wherever the king goes, of course, if I go king to h5, king to h7, if I go to, first of all, to f8, we could capture the queen, which of course will be better even for black. But if I go king to h7, how is the winning? Very easy, by the way. You have a lot of way to win, by the way. What would you do?
Is this a rhetorical question or an actual question?
Actual question, yeah. Very easy.
Rook h6, knight f5,
Queen g7, very easy, yes. Of course, and the reason why I did that is because even though that is very easy, I know, but the whole point of this is like, if you stick to the principles of course, respecting always the candidate move, you will not even consider knight f5, you won't even consider queen f5. Because rook h6 comes first, it's a capture and a check. So that's why you should consider that first. So basically it's about considering and just being aware. And after you capture, then knight f5 and checkmate. Very nice and simple, very simple. So now let's just see how we do in the next one. So this is a sort of artistic puzzle. And first of all, what we have to try to do is, what are we playing for? Are we playing for a win? Are we playing for a draw? So of course, if we are playing for a draw, this shouldn't be a problem. We have 2 options. What should we do here? What should we consider? Of course, 2 checks, right? One is bishop f5 and one is bishop c6. The other is rook to f7. We have 3 different checks. Which one, of course, is the right one? How white wins here? Of course, remember to consider, this is a very concrete position, so using the 3 steps to evaluate the position wouldn't make sense because it's extremely concrete. Whenever the position is extremely concrete, doesn't make any sense to go into these details, basically. So where we should go? Sorry? Bishop c6 is just winning. Okay, let's just take a look. Bishop c6. So let's just go, I go king d6, rook d4, king e5, king here. That is always some tricks. I have a stalemate idea, so that's why. But you know, when it comes to this position, you are, at least you are able, or you are not, well, you know that there are stalemate ideas. So now you will be aware that you cannot take it so lightly. Of course, if you go here, it might look like very simple and you are almost winning, but of course I have these stalemate ideas. So whenever you are doing some calculation process, prophylactic thinking, considering your opponent's ideas is something that of course you have to try to incorporate in your chess DNA. So we have two options. You have bishop c6, and now we just did the elimination process. If bishop c6 is not the answer, of course, you know what is the answer, right? What is the answer? Very nice and simple. Bishop f5, because rook f7 is not working. So the elimination process is very important. As I said at the beginning, in the previous lesson, actually, if you don't know what to do, at least be sure about the things that you should not do. So we know that bishop c6, unfortunately, in this case, is not working, because I can promote, and then it will be stalemate. So then we know we receive some information that, okay, this is not the way how we should do it. We start to consider bishop f5, but of course we have to do this mentally. We cannot do blindfolded. We cannot move just the bishop. So let's just do this exercise. Bishop comes to f5, right? The king have to make a decision whether to go here or here or here, but the king, of course, have to try to basically repeat the same pattern of trying to stalemate the king. So let's say we go bishop f5, king goes to d8, right? And then how we shall continue. Of course, it's about respecting the candidate move. What it comes first? Checks. We don't have any capture, by the way. It's just very simple to understand that. So bishop to f5, king to d8, then, of course, rook d4 next move, right? Rook d4, check. King comes to e7, and I'm doing this mentally because you have to learn to do that. King comes to e7, and then you go back to rook to e4, check. So then, of course, the king will go back to d8, right? In order to create a stalemate situation, because that's what I want to do. So you have to understand that whenever you're playing this position, I will try to create a stalemate situation. Otherwise, I won't be able to win. To hold this position. So with the king on d8, if I take on e3, I know for a fact that you will promote the queen or the rook, and it will be a draw. So at least I know what I should not do. I cannot take the pawn on e3. Why is that not winning? Well, because there is a stalemate situation. So what should I do? Correct. That's very simple. Well, it looks simple now. Bishop to f5, check. So now let's say I go to king to d8. So you keep repeating with the checks. Rook to d4, check. You're following just the principle of the candidate move. Stick to the principles. So actually, calculation is about discipline. If you are not disciplined enough, you won't be able to calculate. Of course, there are some players who calculate better than others, or they can have more imagination. But calculation is about discipline. So check. Rook e4, if the king goes to d8, of course, if I take on e3, then you promote, it's a draw. Unfortunately, because we'll be stalemate. So that's why we know that we cannot take on e3, elimination process. And then what we should do? Well, then this is a beautiful, beautiful bishop d7. Of course, if you take my bishop, then I'm very happy because now I will be taking your pawn. And then, of course, you are not able to promote. But if you promote now queen, and that's what most of the time happens to everyone. They stop their calculation here. Whenever they see that somebody's promoting or giving a check, they stop. So this is another concept that I want to add. Never, never stop your calculation when you still have the chance to play one more move. Never. So you should not stop here. You should add at least one more move. You finish your calculation whenever you're playing your move, whenever you're making your move. That's actually very important. Never stop your calculation before. So whenever you're making your move, you stop. Because of course you cannot pretend that you will be able to see everything. So now bishop b5, then checkmate on e8. And that's how it works. So it's very important because most players, they tend to stop like, oh, they might see bishop d7. They probably consider bishop d7 that they don't see that so seriously because they will say like, I'm promoting, and they panic and they stop. No, don't do that. So always stop your calculation whenever you're making a move. That's very important. And actually, this is a very helpful advice that you need to implement. Threefold move, candidate move, elimination process, but probably the most important part first is actually, well, the understanding part, as I said at the beginning. But the most important part is never stop your calculation whenever you have still one extra move to play. That's very important. That's very important. So that's why bishop d7 works pretty well. Now let's just move on into the next one and see how it goes. So this is a very No, this is kind of very hard. No, not very hard, very too much calculation. I just include that. I don't know why. It was a mistake. So here we have this position, and you have to find a balance whenever you need to. Of course, you might think like, I need to calculate, do I need to evaluate? So this is a class about understanding and calculation. Doesn't mean that you will have to calculate all the time. You have to know when to stop. But before you start to calculate, and this is kind of a clear example for you, to use the 3 steps that I said before. The 3 steps about key safety, material, and of course, the positional aspects, like the quality of your pieces, the quality of your pawn structure, and so on. So we have this position. Probably most of you are already thinking about how to trap the queen, maybe how to trade some pieces, maybe not. But first, I will really encourage you to think based on using these patterns about considering your king safety, and we can do this together, of course. My king, your king, I would say it's kind of pretty even. No proximity of enemy pieces, no weak pawns. My whole structure is covering very well my king. My king is flexible. That's another important thing whenever you're judging your king, if your king can move or not, if your king has a lot of defenders or not, and if the proximity of the enemy pieces are quite a lot or not. So that's very important. So here there is not too many. That's good. Material, very simple, even. Positional, actually I would say kind of even in a sense, but the white has a small edge. And probably you will be disappointed whenever you realize the answer. But my question will be, in this case, probably you have seen this idea, quite simple. If pawn to c5 is good or not, trapping the queen, because most of you probably has this very strong preference for the queen, the most important piece. No, well, the strongest piece. What it matters in chess in general is not about the strongest piece that you have, is what can you do with that extra piece or with that very strong piece. After c5, the queen is trapped. Yes, that's right. That is a fact. However, when you play c5, I could take with the queen. And you will say, oh, queen sack? Yeah. Not really a sacrifice. Because now when I take with the pawn, I will be able to play d4. And whenever I play d4, I will be capturing your bishop. And then I will have 3 minor pieces for a queen. And normally, 3 minor pieces are stronger than a queen. Now d4 will happen, whether like it or not. And after d4 happens, even though if you have a queen, you will be in serious problems. Because what would you do? Probably will say, oh, I can remove my queen. Yeah, you can do that. I can play d4. Now your bishop is trapped. And you could try to insist that the queen is better than 3 minor pieces, but in general, 3 minor pieces are better than a queen, because it's about, well, numbers, and actually it's about if you're playing an end game or a middle game. In normal conditions, 3 minor pieces are better than a queen, because they can simply, these 3 pieces can create mate threats by themselves against the king. And if, I don't know what else you can do, to be honest, because if you take on a6, I will take, I'm taking here, I'm taking here, and it's not easy to me to find a good move for white in this position. I don't know if you probably will agree, because this is about understanding, but in this position in general, it's very hard to prove that the queen is better than the 3 minor pieces, because what can you really do with the queen? If you could create mate threats against the king and with an extra piece, probably I would say the queen is better if you could create mate threats. But that is not the case. 3 minor pieces in normal conditions, basically, let's say like in this position, tend to be better than the queen. This is not a rule, by the way. This is something that you have to learn to understand by yourself, because I know that probably most of you will be confused, like, oh, but it's a queen, you know, the queen, you should not. And everybody is surprised whenever they are seeing a queen sacrifice. This is a real sacrifice because it involves risk. It's a difference, of course. And here the three minor pieces are working together. The king is not really weak because you could not really create pressure against this king, and your whole structure will collapse. The pawn on h3 will collapse. I have presence on the center. And of course, you cannot create mate threats against my king. You cannot create pressure against my king. I will say that the queen tends to be better than three minor pieces whenever the queen is creating mate threats or capturing pawns that will create, of course, potential, well, passers or potential queens. So that's very important to understand. So that's why, in this example, the best move was not to capture the queen. I know probably some of you might think like, okay, but still I will take my risk. I like the queen. Yeah, probably. It's a matter of taste, as I said. But in normal conditions, three minor pieces tend to be better than the queen. So I want you to understand that in normal conditions. And this is probably one of the normal conditions. If you could say that my queen is on h4, and then you have, I don't know, I don't know which piece you could try to add here. Maybe an knight on h5, a knight on f4, or a bishop, or dark square bishop. Then probably we say, yeah, maybe the queen has some chances, but this is not the case. My pieces are really well coordinated. My pieces are very active. My pieces are very well placed in the center, and white is full of weaknesses too as well. Pawn on h3, pawn on c5, and I have a very powerful pawns placed in the center too as well. So I hope this sort of makes sense to you. Once again, this lesson is about understanding, not purely calculation. So in this case, and remember, it's not about the quality of the piece or how strong it is the piece, it's what can you do. And if you could show me what can you do with the queen, I will agree that the queen is better. But I don't think you can do much with the queen in this position, at least. At least I'm not seeing anything special in this move, at least with the queen, that you can do at this particular moment. And if you go in long turn, three minor pieces are way much better than the queen. Normal conditions, endgames, and many things. So just keep that in mind because it's very important. So how much they are better than the queen? I would say, well, if you go to an endgame, you will be worse, for sure. If you go before, to not lose this pawn, for instance, you could just take, and then bye-bye pawn. And of course, then you will reaggregate your pieces. You regroup your pieces by playing bishop g4. You have these two pawns. You just need to maneuver with your pieces very well, and then it still will be very complex, definitely. But now I want to show you this, for instance, this other detail about this position. If you take on e7, white is better. I have the bishops pair that are controlling pretty well the position, and I have, of course, weak pawns that I can put some pressure. Maybe I can play queen on c3, putting some pressure against this pawn. Then I could gain some space on the queen side, and slowly but surely I will keep improving my position. You don't have real counterplay. We have kind of even material, but you have problems with your structure. This is one way. Another way will be queen to a4 as well. How will you defend your position? I don't know, but definitely you will have to face a lot of problems in this position, because even though if you go this, I could keep improving my position, maybe knight to b3, increasing the pressure against that, potentially playing c5, and taking advantage of all the weaknesses once again. The white position is easier to play. There is a difference, and this is probably what most people misunderstand about what it means evaluation. Then they actually tend to think like, how big is the advantage for white here? And if this is +1, +2, +3, and actually that's not, realistically speaking, the real human way that we tend to think. And at least based on my experience and based on what I know, normally grandmasters tend to think in a different way. They tend to think and they tend to see just if the position is easier to play for one side or from the other, for which side is easier to play. So in this case, it will be easier to play as white, period. And that's why I would like to get into this position, not because the white advantage is huge, it's because it's easier to play for me. So that's very important for you to understand whenever you're getting into any transition. It's not about like, oh, my advantage will be very high, very huge because I have +1, computer says so. No, it doesn't matter. Because if you stick just to what computer has to say, you will not be able not even to play King's Indian, not even Grunfeld, not even Najdorf, nothing, because computer, yeah, I mean, have some preference for certain positions. So it's important to understand that detail. So that's why knight takes on e7 is, objectively speaking, the best way to play, because in that way, black has not too many counterplay, and you will be able to just increase the pressure, and for sure, playing for free. That's what most of GN enjoys. Well, of course, all players enjoys that, but when you're playing for free, when you're playing without any risk, if you're playing against a grandmaster, I will recommend you try to create some pressure, try to play even for a win, try to find a way how you can make the player or the grandmaster to get out of his comfort zone, because that's nobody likes to play in a very shaky position. So this was about understanding, of course, and I hope it makes sense for you why here white is better in general, is positionally speaking. So I have better pieces, I have pressure, I have column, the position will be open at some point, and that's why here white is better. In the other position, when you take on d5, probably, maybe if you're playing against one player, maybe you will win, maybe you will lose, but the position is messy. So that's the reality about this. Maybe you could say, oh, but I could take this. Yeah, this will be even better for black, even better, way much better, because now I will be taking on c5 next move, or taking on h3 as well. I will have the column to use, and my king is very safe. And three minor pieces, as I'd say, I would say that at least queen and two pawns, or queen and a pawn, queen and two pawns probably could match in a regular position against three minor pieces. It could be three minor pieces, could be two knights and one bishop, or one rook and two minor pieces too as well. So, okay, and so that's important to understand. Let's just move on to the next one. And let's just see, oh, this one was not. This is more positional. I don't want to, this is fine to watch, but you already know the answer there, so I don't want to spoil that. So, sir?
Which source did you find it in?
You mean the previous one?
Yeah.
I think it was from the Boresky book. I think so. But there are many books who publish that. So, but it's a very, very, I I don't know if to show you that, but let's just stick to this. Probably I will show that later. So, quick question here: can white win this? Are we able to play for a win this? By the way, the pawn is promoting. So once again, we have to stick to the principle of using the candidate move. Oh yeah, that's right. But before you use the candidate move, you have to understand the position. What do you want from this position? And it's not easy to answer that question, because are you really playing for a win, or are you playing for a draw? So that's what you should try to answer in this case. What would you say? White is playing for a win, or white is playing for a draw? That's the first step, by the way. Whenever you're judging any position, you have to understand what are you playing for. You're playing for a win, or you're playing for a draw. If you don't know for what are you playing, then yeah, probably you will make the wrong decision. You will make the wrong call. So it is very important to understand one thing. I want to promote. That's quite simple, quite trivial. It's just very easy to answer. So if I don't remove my knight, the first move is kind of forced. If I don't remove my knight from h3, I'm going to lose. So what should be the first move? Not so hard to understand what is the first move, right? Knight g1. And the next move for black should be or king takes or king f1. So what I want you to understand, and this is actually another important detail, is about understanding the idea about the position. It's not about understanding just finding the best move and so on. No, understand the idea. The idea in this particular position is about trying to capture your knight. If I capture your knight, at least at black, I will be able to hold, probably. So in this case, what would you recommend for black? To take on f2 or to play king to f1? In both cases, what I want to do is, of course, to take your knight. But let's first, so let's just see if you were paying attention, you were paying enough attention or not. what should I consider first? King takes or king f1? Consider. But it's the first that I have to consider because it's a capture. Correct. So then you use the elimination process. Remember that. That's very important. And then you will give yourself more ideas. So when it's about considering, it's not about judging, because there is a misconception about when you say considering is about judging if this is good or bad. No. Considering is about just being able and aware if this is a move that makes sense, of course. If I say king to d2, that doesn't make any sense, of course. So king to f2 is one possibility, and king to f1. Most likely, most of you already understood that. I don't know if, let's say, king f2 is good or not, but I have the feeling that it's bad. Because as you said, the bishop is coming to d4. So that is your intuition. And that is very important, because most players tend to think like, another thing is like, intuition is the first move that you, all of a sudden you are seeing. And I think the easiest way to explain that is not the first move, is, yes, part of the first move, but the idea behind the move. So if you consider that king f2 is not working because potentially there is some bishop d4, okay, that's the idea, bring your bishop to d4. So my question is, if I go king to f2, how do you win? Remember, candidate move, don't start to calculate, consider your option first. What is your first option? What it must be your first option? Is that the first option? I mean, that's the most logical move, but not the first option. What should be the first option? Remember, checks. So it's about considering, remember, it's about considering. It's not about judging if this is good or bad. It's about considering. That's the first step. And then you consider knight h3, and then you consider king f4. So now you have more options. Because if you stick to just, oh, king f4, that looks like the best. Yeah, probably, but that's not the right way how you should do it. Because if you keep doing and repeating that same pattern, then you will not be able to improve your calculation. So first it's about considering. So we have now two options. One is king to h3, and the other is knight to h3, and the other is king to f4. Both ideas are actually connected. So now we have to make a decision. Which one is the right one? Because yes, indeed, king to f4 was the move that I will play instantly. But it's actually not working. Knight h3 is the right move, but why? The pawn. Correct. Let's just take a look over that. And sometimes that's what I like, elimination process once again. We go king f4, makes a lot of sense. Okay, we'll take my knight. Now we go king g3, we have to protect the pawn. Now I move my king. You stop my pawn from promoting. Promote whatever, doesn't matter. But now you cannot promote your pawn. It's not working because I'm not able to take your pawn. So let's just fix it. How we fix that? Very simple. Knight to h3. Now you take. Now your pawn is on h3. Now we play king to d4. You have to, of course, promote. Bishop on d4 check. King on g2. Bishop takes. Take the pawn, go away, and promote. Nice and easy. So nice job based on intuition. So now we know kind of sort of an ideas, and we give ourselves some opportunities to calculate. So remember, the first step is about considering whenever you're doing calculation. Considering, not about judging. If you judge, it's hard then. So remember that. So if king f2, as I said, knight to h3, take, and king to f4. And then I'm just able to do this. And if you try to do this, still king g3, won't change a thing because I still have this bishop coming to d4. Won't change. So that's the why here black was smart and played king to f1. So you instantly recognize that. That's by intuition. Good job there. But now you need to solve the problem. What would you do now? How would you win this? Because now you don't have bishop d4 anymore, at least not in good conditions. So what you should do now? Of course, still you know for a fact that you need to bring your bishop to d4. Because if you don't bring your bishop to d4, you know the idea. That's the most important part. So you need to make it work. If you know the idea, well, then it will be easier. Then the position will become kind of more clear to you. So now you know that you need to bring your bishop to d4. The question is how to do that with tempo. And remember, when we are doing candidate move, checks, captures, then pawn move, and then threats. If you don't use the candidate move, you won't be able to solve this problem. You don't have any checks, you don't have any capture. So the next two are quite easy. For sure it's a pawn move, right? For sure it's a pawn move. If we say f4, we should consider f3. At least it makes sense to us well, right? Both moves make sense. So now we have to use the elimination process because we don't have checks, we don't have captures. So we just have threats and pawn moves. So we just have f3 and f4 because we could say h3, h4, but yeah, okay, they are a pawn move, but they are not connecting with bishop d4 because the whole point of this position is to bring the bishop to d4. So that's the whole idea. So that's why we have to try to make it work. So that's why we have to consider or f3 or f4. And now let's just stick once again to the elimination process. Just by instinct, we know that f3 probably is not the right way to do it because we will take and I will create two threats. One, to take your pawn and promote on h2. Two, to take your pawn on f3 and then you will not be able to win for sure because no pawns, no win. So that left basically is just f4, only way to win. So how do we win? Because I just want to be clear, f3, if I go with this, I just take and creating two threats. And you have to move your king, like it or not. If you don't move your king, you're losing actually, by the way. So you have to move your king, and whenever you take, of course I have this, and it's a draw, but we are trying to win. So we know for a fact that at least f4 is a possibility, it's a candidate. So now f4, king takes, and then what? Sorry? King e4, consider your options once again. Remember, pawn move, well, here you don't have checks, so it will be kind of silly. Pawn move and threats. Sorry? h3? No sense, correct. But you are in the line f4, king takes e1. Then is your chance. You have pawn move and threats. If you make a pawn move there, whenever you play f4, king takes g1, h3 is a pawn move. It doesn't make any sense. You just can remove that instantly. Then you have threats. Can you create a threat? Relevant threat. King e4 is about preventing from promoting, but can you do the same, but at the same time creating a relevant threat? Correct. Correct. So it's f4. Good job there. f4. You push the pawn. King takes, and then once again, if you're playing a bullet game, you will be playing king e4, and you will feel like, oh, I'm doing very well. I consider bishop d4 and so on. But then you realize, oh, I should consider my options first because this is not bullet. We're learning to calculate, and calculation is about discipline, as I said. So once again, we stick to the principles about the threats. So then king f5 is the same thing as king e4, but creating a threat, has a plus. That's the difference. King f5 create a threat, and it's for supporting the idea of playing bishop d4, right? So now I have to take. Now you play bishop d4. It doesn't really matter whatever you do. If you promote, I take everything. If I go g3, what you should do? King g4, correct. So, and then of course, if you promote, doesn't matter. I will be taking everything, and then it's just completely winning because I'm promoted. So that's why it's very important to respect, in a sense, this is a phrase that I like to use in my classes, respect the hierarchies. So you have to move. King e4 creates bishop d4, but king f5 create a threat and create bishop d4. So it's better to pay attention to king f5 because that's what it means, respecting the hierarchies. The hierarchy of the threat is better with the king on f5. So that's why it makes more sense to play king on f5 instead of king on e4. So that's very important. Consider your options. So now let's just move on to the next. I hope this was very clear to you. I don't know if it tells you with this. This is very, 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 very tricky. And it's not an easy position. So let's just move on to the next one. So this position. This is a very simple one. And let's just try to apply what we learned. What are we playing for? Are we playing for a win? Are we playing for a draw? That's the first question. We have to understand that first. Because then you will say, no, I have to play for a win because I'm a fighter. Yes, but your position is hopeless. So you cannot play for a win if your position is hopeless. So then, if you think that your position is hopeless, you should try to find some drawing resources, like a stalemate, like perpetual, like a fortress, or whatever, or triple repetition. I don't know. Threefold repetition is a useful method too as well. So what are we playing for here? That's the first question. Are we playing for a draw? Are we playing for a win? What would you say? White to move, yes. Seems bad. Maybe there are some resources, but yes, definitely seems bad because, I mean, bishop is coming to c7, checking the diagonal. So this is very hard. The knight is under attack. So you have a lot of, if we just use the three steps that I just mentioned, definitely white is worse, and I will explain that. Why my king is worse? Well, it's because he's going to be under attack first. So my king is better than the white king, just to start with. Material, we are even. Yes, okay, that doesn't matter. Positional, the quality of my pieces are better. They are creating threats. White's pieces are not creating any single threat. So that's why this is not holdable. That's why this will be a terrible position for white to play. So now you have to try to play for, at least try to find a way if you are able to hold. Which resources can you consider in this position? That's a very important thing to mention. Normally, when you are trying to hold in a position, you should consider, of course, as I said, stalemate, fortress, transitions into very well-known endgames that are, we know for a fact that it's a draw, transition into an endgames, of course, threefold repetition, 50-move rule, and basically that will be all. But in this position, what applies to this position? Because of course we cannot say about, for instance, perpetual. I think will be very unlikely to happen, or 50-move rule, for sure no. Stalemate, maybe. Transition into a drawish endgame, maybe. You have to, as I said, whenever you're judging any position or scanning, so let's just say scanning, and then you start to judge, the quality of the black pieces are better, the quality of the structure. So this is very interesting because when you're seeing the structure, you have to consider this structure and the minor pieces that you have. It's not about like, oh, I'm considering the structure as a just sole beam. No, it's this structure along with the minor pieces that you have. So in this case, what about this guy and this structure? What, it's kind of wrong square. Correct. So that's very important to understand. That's why using this positional aspect will give you more insights about the position. Is the wrong color, unfortunately, for this bishop, because this bishop won't be able, of course, to control this diagonal. Operates in a different dimension, unfortunately for us. So that's why in this case, now we know, and now we have one information. If we trade off rooks, it's a draw, right? That it will be a transition into a drawish endgame. Now we know what we want to do. We know what we cannot do a stalemate, we know we cannot do perpetual, but we know we can do a transition into a very well-known theoretical endgame that it will be a draw. How can we remove this rook from the picture? That it will be an idea, correct. Now you know the idea. Now try to make it work. Because it's not like it's going to be easy, of course.
Maybe knight e5, bishop c7, rook to h1, rook takes h1, king g2, rook f1, knight d3 check. Maybe not knight d3, knight f3 check, king e2, knight d4, and then you repeat on either f3 or on c2.
Correct, because I cannot take the knight. I cannot escape from the corner, right? That's right. That's good. Correct. Good job. Very nice job. So that's why it's very important to understand first. Whenever you are seeing any position, understand first what are you playing for, and try to understand. As I said, mainly I know that this is, of course, a class for 1800 plus. So I would say basically, of course, considering the king is quite simple, but normally that's what most players they are missing. Material is very easy. Even my daughter can count material probably. But positional aspers, they are the trickiest one because we normally see the structure as I said, as just mainly the structure, but we have to connect structure, minor piece. Are they working together? If they are not, see the difference. And as we discover, of course, pawn promoting in the wrong color, and 95 is the right way, of course. So now bishop on c7 and rook to h1. This is beautiful, by the way. I love this move. So when you take, I have king g2. And now it's a draw. Why is a draw? Because of course you won't be able to promote this pawn on h1 because it's on the wrong color of the bishop. So although of course I don't know if I have something more. Well, I have to take, of course, and then you play king on g2. Very nice. And whenever the rook comes here, of course not 93, but it's the right idea. Once again, always, as long as you consider the idea, that will give you a lot of hints about the position. So knight f3, and now of course this will be kind of course a draw, because here take, and then, well, will be perpetual basically. Although here I don't know if I can take, by the way, and then the king will be here. I don't know if, well, oh, but you will be coming here, right? Because now I'm not so sure if this is the right move order. Now I'm very confused because this makes sense, but rook h1. Might not be a draw actually, because I have that that trick, right? Oh, I see. But you have a. Oh, wait. But you have these too, right? Stalemate. Yeah, it still works. I thought that okay, knight of 3. I felt like okay, but still you have a stalemate. Wow, I not even consider that. But of course, the idea looks like so good that it should work somehow, right? It's still stalemate. Knight c1. Wow, beautiful. Yeah, because if I don't take, then what would I do? Then it will be just yeah. I didn't see that coming, to be honest. I was just considering, but it's very funny. But because instantly you saw 93 and then you stop after 93 king e2. Do you make that basically? And I did the same mistake. Like we stop when still we had another move to play. We start so early, so don't do that. So always consider to add another move. So that's very nice actually. Because king g2 I think works true as well, if I'm not mistaken. Because if you take rook h1 and if you do this, well, doesn't matter. It still will be a draw. But now this is, I mean, if you ask me, this is more beautiful, of course. Rook h1, you just take me as I said, and then king g2, rook here, and then knight d3. And of course, is a stalemate or perpetual? I don't know, but wherever you make it work, or it will be a transition into a veteran game. So basically, you will have 3 in 1, right? 3 ideas in just one puzzle. Like, it's very, very, very weird to see like transition into a very well-known endgame that is a draw, a stalemate, or perpetual. So pick your poison. And yeah, and actually, I think that's actually will be all for today, if I'm not mistaken. And I just want to show you one last but not least, because it was very beautiful, and I just want to not miss the opportunity to show you. This is a very nice position, actually. That's why it's plays and win. And actually, it's just the right thinking process in this position is just to solve the, I would say, to solve the artistic puzzle, you have to use one concept, that is prophylactic thinking, to understand whatever your opponent wants to do. And what black wants to do is to push the pawn to e2. And we cannot really stop that. But why e2 is a threat? Well, because you will be targeting my rook. And of course, I'm playing for a win and I'm playing for a draw. And even if, well, even if I'm playing for a win, still e2 will be winning for black. So I have to find a way to prevent that. But then you realize, Okay, but I cannot really prevent E2 from happening. So then what you should do? Well, as usual, don't use passive defense. Use active defense. Counter attack. That's very important. And the only way to counter attack here is against this guy here. And in order to understand whether a king is a draw, whether a king is in a good position or bad position, you have to see if the king is mobile, if the king can move. And the king has not too many squares. And actually the only square available is light squares. So that gives you kind of another hint that maybe this guy could create more pressure against that king. So, of course, creating some mate ideas will make sense, maybe rook hit and so on, but that's too slow. You cannot do that. E2 is happening. So, but of course, the idea of putting pressure against the king is something that we want to do. But of course, we have to find a right way to do it. The only, of course, rook d1 and rook d8 is not the only way to attack the king. There is another way to attack the king, and that is with rook to a1. Very nice, yeah. So now e2, and now, of course, bishop to f1. You want to take me? Okay, I don't mind. I mean, this is fine. I can win this. Because you cannot even take this pawn, by the way. We are going to explain that. But if I promote queen, now it comes checkmate, of course. First, checks and captures. Well, this is a capture and a check. So you will have to take my rook. Then pawn to b4, checkmate. Which is very unlikely to see on checkmate with a pawn. So that's why this is a very beautiful idea. But as I said, prophylactic thinking is the key. And I just want to be clear about this. So what if I go b4, just to finalize with this lesson this time? Use the prophylactic thinking, meaning do not allow your opponent to be happy. Do not calculate, just use the prophylactic thinking. What I want to do, what I want to achieve. Of course, I want to capture your pawns or to be able to bring my king. So what you should do? Yeah. Don't stress yourself thinking about how you should calculate, how you should play. No, just be mean. Do not allow your opponent to create counterplay. Maybe you will win by capturing on b4. Yes, maybe. But you will need to calculate and play more accurate. But if you play c4, you cannot take me. You go b5, okay, c5. I won't allow your king to get it into the game. Because when that happens, then you will regret it. So using the prophylactic thinking is the key to solve many, I would say, of course, doesn't work just only for artistic puzzles. It works pretty well on endgames. That's the best technique, actually. In endgames, what you have to understand is about improving the strongest piece that you have over the board and using prophylactic thinking constantly. And yeah, so actually, with that said, actually, that will be all for today, guys. So I hope you learned something. Remember that this candidate move is about considering, not about judging. So that's very important. But before calculating, evaluate the position in the right and proper way. Try to understand what are you playing for. Don't just play lightly, just what are you playing for? And of course, understand always the idea of the position. And don't forget about checks, captures, pawn move, and threats. The first two, that must be your rule. Okay? So, okie dokie.
10 years, one legacy. The Grand Chess Tour marks a decade of mastery where only the strongest chess minds carve their names into history. Each piece has its role, like soldiers in a grand army, with commanders to lead them into the tour's 10th year and a prize fund of $1.6 million. The Grand Chess Tour starts in Warsaw with the Superbet Rapid and Blitz Poland, immediately followed by the Superbet Chess Classic Romania in Bucharest. Then off to Zagreb for the Super United Rapid and Blitz Croatia, followed by back-to-back events in St. Louis, Missouri with the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz and the Sinkfield Cup. And the culmination of the grand finale in the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, will determine the 2025 Grand Chess Tour champion. Fight with every ounce of strength for victory. This isn't just a moment. This is history.